started re-listening to the podcast again.
Oh, wow.
We live? Yeah. Okay. All right, we're live. Hi, my name is Moritz Braun. I'm the founder of Just for the Record. It's my pleasure to welcome the Unfuck guys on our Twitch live stream today. Let me introduce them one by one. Oh, sorry, I gotta turn off my own audio. Here we go.
Nice, it's working.
It's working.
Good sign.
All right, we got Spider, Ron Entwistle here. He's a former recording artist, record producer, turned into, I would say, studio life coach, community ambassador. Is that correct to say, I guess?
Yeah, fair enough.
Okay, great. Then we have Kyle Mann here. He's a recording and mixing engineer and self-proclaimed audio whore. And we got Ruairi O'Flaherty, who is a mastering engineer. All three of them together found the company Unfuck Your Studio, which is a consulting company that specifies on music creators' rooms, and is the main mission, I would say, if that's correct, is to unlock the client's full potential in all aspects regarding the record-making process. Is that fair to say?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
that's a good description. I think Rory has a good way of encapsulating what we do and what makes us different.
Yeah.
If you
Yeah,
wanna
yeah. Something that
jump
we
on
often
that.
talk about at the start of our workshops. I think that, you know, we're not quite an acoustics company. It's not really what we do. I think the thing that makes us different to anyone else who works in the acoustic space is that we're primarily record makers. So Spider was a signed artist, produced, engineered for years, ran studios, you know, had publishing deals. Kyle is recording and mixing every day with people like Victoria Monet and has mixed Ariana Grande records and is in the room making records all day, every day. We're doing it. I'm mastering records every day. And I think that the way that we think about acoustics and the things around them, around that, everything is centered on the experience of the person making the records and most importantly, where they want to go. So I think we think of ourselves as sort of being more holistic than the typical service provider. So a very normal acoustician or architectural acoustics company, you will come to them and say, I want to build this studio in my garage, or I want to modify this. And they'll say, okay. And you're like a shopper buying a product. You know, they'll offer you some solutions and you'll say yes. We're different in that before we do anything, we'll do a deep dive with the client and try and figure out, you know, we had one workshop with an amazing producer who recently had a epic record drop. And the workshop started with, you know, where should I put my bass traps, and ended with, I'm moving from one music making city to another one. You know, and this was a consequential decision for family, for work, for career, for relationships. So that kind of, yes, acoustics, but in the context of the bigger career journey, the bigger goals, the bigger ambitions. And that process, that workshopping process is a huge part of what we do. And we'll often say to people, look, the acoustics part, it's interesting, you know, and we have some skills in it and some experience, but it's secondary to helping you get where you want to go. They're just tools, you know. We don't want to be a bunch of carpenters sitting around all day talking about our hammers. We're not that interested in hammers. We're interested in record makers, songs, what music can do to connect people, communities, well-being, daylight. Hammers are great. You know, we just geeked out about hammers in the lounge for an hour, but it's not the primary thing.
Focus, yeah.
It's a tool in service of something greater. And so, yeah, and I think what we describe to people as our end point is if we get your work together with a client and we get to the end of the process and it's gone well, then you should really never think about your room or speakers again. It's sort of suddenly, you know, the last thing you want halfway during painting your masterpiece is to be thinking about the canvas, going like, is it stretched enough? Is it like, what's that little blemish there? You know, is this going to look good in the gallery? Like, that's not very friendly to painting your masterpiece. You get the room and the speakers dialed within your budget, within your goals, within your constraints, and then you stop thinking about it and you start focusing on the client's mood,
Yeah.
or the feeling of the record, or even the culture. Where are things?
Sources of inspiration.
Yeah, where are things
yeah.
going?
Yeah.
Or just your lunch.
Yeah.
Like, but so that's it. When we've done our job well, it sort of disappears into the background and hopefully becomes the canvas that people can paint their future on, you know?
Yeah. So we have a couple of questions that people submitted within the last couple of days on Instagram. Before we dive into some of those, I would be very curious to just hear what's a couple of things you're looking for to get out of a client when you talk to them for the first time. What are some key points you want to hit to get a better understanding of how you might be able to help them? What's some questions you would ask a client in the first consultation?
Well, I'll say that I don't normally attend the first consultations, so they should be answering this, but I'm going to jump in and say that every time we talk to somebody, we treat them as though they're us, right?
Yeah.
We're talking to music creators like music creators. That's sort of our rhythm. It is our speed. It is the crowd with which we are most comfortable. So, yeah, what are we looking for? We're looking just to connect on that sort of artistic level. The most important thing is understanding who they are and what they're trying to accomplish and helping to facilitate that.
Mm-hmm.
But I'll let you guys sort of actually talk about the process.
Yeah, I think that the tone that we take tends to be like we'll treat up and coming people as if they're destined to be A-list people. You know, it's a kind of it's really what we're doing is approaching our clients the way traditional producers would approach artists, and you do need to understand an artist's value sets, and what artists bring is like a set of preferences, and everyone's unique, and to really produce a record for someone, you need to know a little bit about them. So that's the way we're going into it, in a framework that is optimistic and creates space for people's imagination. And I think the understanding a story about where people come from and where they'd like to go, and for a lot of us, it's really hard even to admit to ourselves what we really want.
For sure.
You know, these things don't seem practical, and there's a lot of downward pressure from economics and personal finances and family life and this sort of thing.
Or external influences on YouTube or Instagram.
Yeah, social. Yeah, so it's, you know, there are a lot of competing forces, and I think one of the primary things we're trying to do is understand what motivates them emotionally.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what's the thing that they're gonna do automatically, even when they've gotten off a plane, hungover, you know, jet
What's
lag.
the intrinsic motivation?
Like, where is that? Where does that lie? So how can we lay down tracks that'll harness that energy?
Great.
And really empower. We're seeking to empower the clients to even make further discoveries, because what we know about ourselves is continually being updated. You know, we're not trying to unfuck somebody's studio. It's unfuck your studio. It's you do it, and we're helping you.
Right.
You
I
know
think
what
that's a key aspect.
It's a teach a man to fish.
Yeah. That's very important to understand, I think, for the people watching, that we spoke about that earlier, and I know you guys for a while now. It's way deeper than picking acoustic panels, a fabric, and where to place them. It's really like your guys' approach is way more about the holistic creative process, depending on what it is. Different process for different people, obviously. But I really appreciate that you guys are trying to figure that out and help that person unlocking their full potential, rather than having like a one size fits all kind of treatment plan that you can just buy, basically.
Yeah, just going by the numbers in the charts is very incomplete. If
Yes.
you look at what opportunities lie within any studio upgrade project.
Yeah.
You know.
I mean, a lot of factors and variables with any client are probably very different, down to economics, living situation, how far they're down in their career, what kind of music they're working on, what part of the creative process they are in within the record making process.
And we spend a lot of time talking about their work and what is the thing that they're trying to get to and trying to unlock.
Yeah, and I think the to be honest about it, we're still discovering. You know, we're only a couple of years into this journey, sort of formally together, and we're still discovering what we're capable of, or you know, I think this workshopping element, this sort of career goals element, is in some ways sort of becoming more distinct from the room building process, and it's like you have to go through this workshopping process to get to a room building project to do it effectively. We're very much in the mode of sort of workshop deeply, and then our first drafts 99% of the time hit the mark. People are like, that's it, that's the room. And they're very different. You know, we're not, you know, I think of this a lot, again, from the record making point of view. I don't want to be a mastering engineer whose work sounds the same. I want my records to be, my bossa nova records to be sweet and warm and dynamic, and I want my, you know, nasty whatever record to be all of the things that a modern record could be or should be. I want that diversity in the outcome. And same for us. We're not looking to build one room over and over again. We're looking to build rooms that help people's careers go forward. And what that is very different. But the through line is that they're all rooms that we would be happy to work in. If it won't meet, if a client is like, guys, I don't have the money, just, you know, can you just phone it in? Can we just do a quickie room? We're kind of like, you know, respectfully, not really. Because it's a disservice to you, and
it's not what we do.
It's not what we do.
No, it's not to say we couldn't improve a space by going, can you show me how to make some bass traps? But it's not, that's not unlocking the thing that makes this special.
Yeah, and so a lot of where we're at right now is sort of figuring out, you know, in 2 years we've gone from these smaller projects to doing rooms like the Z room. We're about to set off on 2 more big rooms. We're doing a big project for Ryan Lewis. And we've got one big mastering room coming that will be sort of state of the art for what we can do. And again, really, really optimized for a particular client.
Yeah.
And that process and what we can do for clients with tighter budgets, you know, young producers and mixers coming up, we're figuring out a lot of things about how to be effective in those spaces without taking on too much, because I think, just to close out the point, we're not going to be, at least in the short term, doing this full time. We're all, Spider's out with his PMC clients in the artist relations. He's in different rooms every day, meeting different record makers, which I did with PMC for 8 or 9 years.
Yeah.
And the level of learning and engagement in those rooms is incredible. The amount of experiences. You go from the scoring stage at Sony on a Danny Elfman movie to Trent Reznor's house to a young producer. You know, the Monsters and the Strangers, when they were just starting out, I was in their studio in North Hollywood, and it's like I parked up outside and I'm like, is my car going to be there when I get back? Like, everything was sketch about it, and now they're huge, you know. So that breadth of experience that Spider has, Kyle's making records every day. If we don't have that, if I'm not mastering records every day, my reference point for how great a room can be, we can't bring that to the client. So I think a big part of our credibility, our relevance in the space, is that we are record makers. So
100%.
Trying to balance that. How can we take on enough projects, be efficient, help as many people as possible, sort of our mission, but not spread ourselves too thin.
Yeah, so the project between the 3 of us has been to refine the process that we take people through.
Yeah.
And we're continually updating it. Like, the Unfuck process is really makes this possible because we do have these other things we're doing. It enables us to be able to be efficient and to keep our fees from ballooning, keep the budgets from these projects from ballooning, and be maximally effective. And for me, there's like a very, and we've all talked, the 3 of us have talked about this, how rewarding it is to nail it for somebody and the kind of feedback we get down the line. I mean, this Ed room is probably the most inspiring studio I've ever been in.
Yeah.
You know, some things, if I were building my own room, I would do differently, of course. But that's
Man,
the nature of a bespoke room.
Yeah.
You have to check this room out.
I would love to, yeah.
That Starry Sky feature is really, that's a whole other thing.
I've only seen pictures so far. But I can speak to that myself. Like, whomever I recommended your services to of my friends, they were overwhelmed afterwards. It was a complete changed in their process. Everything got faster. There was more confidence. There was more efficiency in the process, and ultimately, the level up came. It really does make a huge difference if you're in a space where you can be confident with whatever you're doing versus trying to guess a lot.
Yeah.
So a lot of the questions that we got are in that lane. Would you guys like to hear some of those, or you want to talk about anything else first?
No, do it.
please.
Let's get into it.
Cool. First one from H3X. Besides facing the short wall, first reflections and a cloud, and speakers up against the wall, what is your next step in diagnosing more issues?
That's way zoomed in compared to what
We can have something else first too if you all
Oh,
want.
that's
No.
fine. That's fine.
No.
I think that
Maybe you guys can explain your. He seems to know a little bit about your process already. There's like one step, and that's quite specific for what you all do. Is
Maybe we should just outline sort of our basic criteria for a listening space.
yeah.
Because
great.
the question of short wall versus long wall to me already says, like, hang on one second.
Yeah.
And speakers against the wall. There's some things maybe you want to elaborate on, as Kyle just said.
Yeah. That they're I think if there's one weird trick to making rooms sound good, it's to accept that there isn't one weird trick. And be immediately suspicious of people who say, Trinav, sonar works, all your problems are gone. Just these panels, just this diffuser, just this whatever. You know, if it's that kind of simple bolt-on solution, you know, so we'll give people, you know, in the video we did it at the Loft with John, we did say if there's one thing you're going to do, put your speakers against the wall. It works
Yeah.
99% of the time.
I'm sure you got some responses afterwards. This didn't work at all for me, or
Yeah, and they're
Actually,
they're,
no.
Oh,
It
okay.
works.
Yeah.
It works.
It works.
Yeah.
I think
Great.
Lars Stoffers
No.
is the sole exception of a
yeah,
room
because
that,
of the weird front wall.
Yeah,
that's not a front wall.
yeah,
Right.
it was interesting challenge in that room, and it just worked great off the wall. But I think to your question, Kyle, you know, what are we trying to do in a listening space? What are we trying to achieve? You're looking for, I presume that, you know, I'm assuming that question is coming from the point of view of someone who's in a spare room or a small kind of production room, like a North Hollywood style, you know, 14 by 16 with a 8 or 9 foot ceiling, the typical spaces that we find people starting out in. And in that situation, you're within your resources, you're trying to create a clear stereo image and trying to find a balance between the frequency response and the time domain response that makes sense. And that's very hard on a budget. It's very hard to nail the low end without doing real low end treatment. And I think there's more questions coming on that later, so we'll wait. But trying to get the frequency response under control so there aren't crazy peaks and dips, trying to get the balance between the direct sound field from the speakers and the reflections from the room in proportion, trying to minimize things like desk reflections where we can. What else? What am I missing?
I mean, the first criteria is always workflow. What is it that you need the room to do?
Yes.
That's the biggest framework that this whole thing fits on, or the most important framework. Once that has been established, which we assume in this case it has, then it's about getting the speakers on the wall, getting symmetry, and making sure that, at least for imaging, first reflection points are not. Those are truly the biggest things. That doesn't handle any of the low-end problems, but and it doesn't really handle the time domain problems, which are the low-end problems, but that's another discussion I'm sure we'll get into. But in terms of just like, how do I make a system that sort of behaves more or less correctly? Get your speakers on the wall, sit a third of the way into the room, and, you know, treat first reflection points, especially a cloud. And I mean, we talked about that a lot.
The secondary thing would be, because the questioner says cloud, first reflection, speakers on the wall, on the short end. I think like often the cloud is number one in terms of treatment. I think, I don't know, I've heard Ruairi say many times that it does most of the heavy lifting. So if there was a single thing you could do, you would start there and then do your side reflections. And I think the next thing we do is try to deal with the back wall, depending on how far it is.
And that's mainly for like bass management, I assume?
No, it's for keeping the back wall from like being involved too much in the conversation.
Okay.
It's like a kind of somebody tapping you on the shoulder the whole time while you're working.
Right.
And because your brain can't, within a certain distance, that the time it takes for the sound to go past your head, from the speaker past your head to the wall and then back to your ears, if that time is too short, your brain can't pick it apart from the record.
Okay. That's a great analogy. Yeah. Someone tapping you on the shoulder. I know exactly what you're talking about. It's agitating to work in an environment like this where you constantly get information from the back.
I was just in Honolulu with one of our clients, Noah Cronin, just dialing in his new PMCs. And he took a video I posted up, and people were asking me why I was cupping my ears and going like this. And I was just saying it's a crude way of isolating what's going on from the back of the wall.
Okay.
From the back wall, like blocking the...
Yeah, I've seen Ruairi doing this a lot.
It always starts with this, and then it'll end up being sort of this thing where you're hearing a reflection over here, and you're finding it. And ultimately, you're just looking for like, where are these problems that we need to pick off? And they're not always intuitive. Obviously, the cloud is and the sides are obvious, but you might have some thing, a box somewhere that has a reflective surface.
Yeah, especially when you get in the weird shaped rooms and vaulted ceilings, it gets very unpredictable, hard to model.
I can imagine.
And this is it's hard to generalize here. I mean, we can be a little more specific because of the tone of the question or the context of the question, but in what we do in a room like the Z room, we're engineering out all of these problems. From the ground up, we're saying, delete those problems before they ever existed.
Sure.
But in a producer's studio, so he's renting or she's renting, they're going to be there 2 years, maybe 3 if the landlord doesn't kick them out or the neighbors don't complain. And in situations like that, what we're often doing is, and this is hard to generalize, it's hard to teach, although we want, I'll come back to that. We want everyone to learn this stuff and do it. If someone watches me and Spider tune speakers, I want to answer every question they have. I want to give them every piece of knowledge I have, and hopefully they'll do that with their friends better than they would otherwise. There's no secrets. We've been very lucky to be the beneficiaries of a lot of generosity from very smart people like Thomas Joanjean or my friend Dave Collins. They've been very open with everything they know, and we're sort of carrying that responsibility forward. We're not interested in withholding. But there is a thing that gets tricky, that's hard to teach and it's hard to learn if you don't get to do it 1,000 times or 2,000 times over like we have, which is balancing imperfections. So the analogy I often use is, in a bedroom studio where we don't have real low-end treatment, we just have panels, kind of GIK or real traps or whatever, LA sound panels or whatever, John Hunter stuff, and we have near fields, of the order of some JBLs or some Genelecs or some small PMCs. So we don't have real treatment. We don't have walls we can move. We're stuck with doors where the doors are. In a situation like that, you have to balance the various factors in a way that is musical and that translates as best it can to the real world.
Like an audio engineer does.
The analogy I use with mixing is that, it's great when you are mixing a record that everything sounds amazing and you push up the faders to 0 back when there were faders and everything sounds balanced. And that's amazing. But it never happens. What happens is the guitar is too bright and the bass is too woolly. But the two together, when you push them up, there's a kind of a weird sort of spiky and woofy. And hey, we've got a reggae record. This actually makes sense. This is kind of two wrongs that are balancing, right? And quite often in rooms, we're doing some version of that where we're trying to balance the frequency response, which is, the amount of highs and mids and lows, with the time domain response, which is how long do those various frequency bands hang around in the room. It's kind of reverb, but it's not really. But the way our ears hear, especially as we get down into the lower mids, the upper bass, the bass, that energy hangs around in the room a long time in a typical small studio. and that affects how we perceive it. So the frequency response graph doesn't contain the information we need.
We should jump into that as a proper subject, but I want to say in terms of your mix analogy, and in terms of what we do, I think it's a good analogy in that you mentioned sort of the good balanced mix, the static mix. Much like in record making, that's not a good mix, right? Yeah. Making it so you can hear everything is not a compelling mix.
That's how I mix, which is why I don't mix anymore.
but in terms of finding the song and telling the story,
yes.
right, guiding the listener, we have to do the same thing in a studio space. And in this case, the listener is the mixer or the producer or the engineer that is working there. And the song is, what do they value? If you have somebody who loves to work really loud and needs that knock, their priorities are much different from the guy who's making jazz records all day.
Yes.
Interesting.
And we cannot take the same approach. I mean, in a perfect world, obviously, we have a room like Anton's room where it's essentially great because it's a very good representation, or a Thomas and Northwood room where it's like you could do anything in it. But when we're talking about production spaces, where we have to tailor, basically playing whack-a-mole. I mean, you know this.
Knowing
this
what compromises or
Yes.
what intelligent trade-offs
right
to make.
What actually matters in this
Yes.
case.
I'm sure it also plays a role what the environment of the client is. What are they used to? What is their experience? Zed, for example, plays a lot of shows, right? I'm sure he has a certain sensory experience when he plays his records in these arenas or stadiums
Clubs or Vegas. Or
yeah,
You were here for some of the conversations we had here about that.
and
It was really fascinating.
very interesting because he was looking for something that would translate that kind of sensory impact in his studio, which is really hard to emulate, I can imagine, because you don't have a massive PA in a room. And
in a way that isn't wildly misleading.
We're going through that with a new project right now. We're in the workshop phase with a client. We're building a mastering room that's going to be really, really exceptional. And where we've landed at this stage in the workshop process is, this client came up as a DJ, and he's not a technical guy. Capable, but not technical, doesn't want to think about technical stuff too much.
Yeah.
He's a vibe guy, and he likes abusing gear, and he likes pushing level into transformers and tubes and building, and he's the kind of mastering engineer you go to when you appreciate that aesthetic. He's someone who takes a good record and makes it dangerous, makes it exciting, and brings something to it, right? Not a safe pair of hands. So
in a good way.
In a good way, yeah. I mean, that as a compliment.
like adding a certain
completely unsafe.
If you want a safe pair of hands, you go somewhere else.
Yep.
So with that in mind, what do we value in mastering? We've got to have a great frequency response. We've got to have a great time to main response. We've got to have accuracy. We've got to have perfect balance and imaging. But where we landed is this client wants the room to have 1 foot in the club, or one toe in the club. So it's like, if we need to trade off perfection and accuracy and dryness and control for sort of a little bit of heft and weight, then that's a good place. That's a good design goal for us, and that's informing the type of speakers that we're going to go with. 15-inch drivers on some big PMCs instead of 12s.
Yeah.
We're looking for a particular aesthetic. It's a kind of looseness, but it's a musically and emotionally useful, maybe necessary.
For him, that might be his version of a linear response, right? Because he knows how a record should feel in a club.
It's emotionally linear.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's at a very high level. That's going to be a $300,000 room when all is said and done. But that same principle applies to, a young producer. She's starting out and she's in a bedroom, in Hollywood, with, $2,000 speakers and 12, 15 panels. We have to compromise somewhere. We have to balance variables. And it's like, well, if you want to be mastering, then we have to accept that the sweet spot will be tiny and that we're building a very, very controlled thing. No one can share this space with you. It's going to be like a little cockpit. If you're a collaborator, then we're writing songs. Then we have to think about the relationship to the couch. We have to think about, we're going through that with a young songwriter right now. After our workshops, his response to our first drafts was all about seating and connection, rightly so.
Yes.
Like, this is great, but I often have more people in my session than you guys have drawn seats. So how can we think about that? You know?
Cool.
And it's like that's excellent. That's
Yeah.
that's right now is exactly the right time to be thinking about that.
Yeah.
So that again, once that first session happens, that it's just seamless and
Yeah.
you know.
It's actually hitting me now the way clients like Zed or this new mastering client that have this kind of idiosyncrasy in the way that they perceive music that comes from their experience. Collectively, the three of us have to, and I think we just have intuitions around this, like when that idiosyncrasy is maladaptive and in their way, and when it actually empowers them.
Mhm.
Yes.
And to try to, again, this is all part of the workshopping process. Understand, again, it's an empowerment thing. It's like, we'll go to the mat for an idiosyncratic perspective if we believe it empowers the client, right?
Yes.
We'll fight for that, and we'll find it actually causes us to innovate in ways, and I don't think that would be possible without our collective experience
Yeah.
making records and understanding that like pretty graphs don't equate to great records.
And
You know what I
also,
mean?
I'm sure there's, as you said, there's different budgetary realities for different clients and people looking for different results at the end of the day. One of the questions here, for example, is how do I double my mixing room as a vocal recording space also?
Yeah.
That's a very interesting question, right? With is this a priority, or is this kind of like an afterthought that I can occasionally record vocals there? How would you approach a question like that?
Well, we'd want to know why.
Yeah.
Oh, obviously, some people like to just record vocals in the control room, and that's okay.
Yeah.
The thing is, usually, if the control room is set up well, it's already fairly anechoic, so it's not that hard to stick somebody in a corner and get a good vocal sound. But there's also sort of other ways to handle it. We're wrapping up Caleb's, and
Yes.
his design. His design incorporates gobos, which are deliberately reflective to the mix position for psychoacoustic reasons. But they're on wheels because occasionally he does vocals in his control room, and he wants to be able to have like a mini booth,
Yeah.
so he can just roll them over and
You just turn him 180
yeah.
degrees
So
and then
the
it's
other side is absorptive,
Great.
and now he's got a little mini vocal booth that he can stick somebody in. And
So for people who
That's
know this
awesome.
room, you have you have the hard front wall. In Caleb's case, that hard front wall is there's a real front wall, and then there's a sort of a fake hard front wall that you can pull out and turn into the vocal booth.
Cool.
It's sort of a like a camper van, kind of like
Yeah.
it sort of adapts, and it's not his normal use case, but it is it was enough of a use case that we needed to consider it, and it was sort of an area that he wanted to develop.
And
So
it
again,
also solved some problems because we were able to then put pressure-based absorption in the front corners.
yes,
In a room that did not accommodate that
Mhm.
otherwise.
that
Yeah.
That's
which
a great example, though, of how can you have a versatile room that services different purposes, right?
Yes.
I mean, there's flexible solutions to these kind of things, and it doesn't have to be just for one purpose, really, right?
Yeah, and it's different for each client. There is no
Yeah.
sort of one size fits all. There are
Yeah.
underlying principles, but we're sort of wheeling them in service of something different in each case. You know.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Oh, to answer the specific question again, I'm assuming that's coming from someone who's working in smaller. You know, if you're at Conway, then you just put a mic in the back of the room and go for it, right?
Yeah, that's
But from someone who's in a smaller situation, the primary thing that you won't have in the rear of a room that's done on a budget is ceiling treatment. So usually, like we did for Nathan West Spider, that was a two great young clients of ours who were mixing, producing, recording in a fairly small bedroom, you know, and PMC 6s, first reflection, freestanding gobos because it's a rented space, hung a cloud, and in the because they do a lot of vocal recording in the room, there's a second cloud at the rear of the room, which isn't helping the listening position really at all. It's just for tracking instruments. So there's a freestanding gobo as the back wall between a closet door and the main door. So you have a gobo behind and a cloud above, So it's really just about the ugliest thing in most vocal recording scenarios is the ceiling. Because you think about a typical singer is between 5 and 6 feet tall, and the ceiling is usually 8 feet. So that first reflection is coming back 4 milliseconds.
Yeah.
And that's ugly. So whereas, say, the reflection off of the front wall in their room is coming back 15, 18, 20 milliseconds later. And that's better. It's acceptable. It's not as coloring. So, yeah, the main thing is wherever you record vocals, think about ceiling treatment and, if possible, some freestanding gobos. We like to use a lot, is LA specific advice, but we use these freestanding gobos from John Hunter that are excellent value, and they're pretty, they're reusable, you can move them to your next apartment. But there are equivalents from like GIK or other people.
Why not just use reflection filters?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. Why not use a reflection filter? Do you want to take that one, Kyle?
A reflection filter?
The thing.
That's what I was about to ask. Please give us your take on that. I'm very curious.
Because they don't sound good. Anytime that you use one and try it with and without, it's always worse with.
Yes.
Without exception. And yes, it's a cool technical looking thing that makes, your studio space look like a studio or whatever, and it costs you $300. But in terms of like actual use, $300 in packing blankets and a couple of mic stands to hang them from is a much better investment. Not as pretty, but certainly going to be a more useful thing to have around than this.
Less painful for your mixer.
So I want to tag on that. So Kyle's point is really clear and are really well made. And the reason that most people can't tell that their reflection filter isn't working is because their control room is not dialed
They're
enough
not in a
that they can hear
position
the
to
difference.
evaluate it.
If you're like, how do you know you need a ceiling cloud for the vocal if you listen to the playback in the room that doesn't have enough treatment?
Right.
That reflection is also on the playback, and it's a big model.
Probably hear it better on headphones.
Maybe on headphones, yeah.
But
so, a huge thing. There's a kind of a process of graduating in some way to having heard and used better rooms. And that's why a facility like what you've got is so important, because it's accessible, it's affordable enough for almost everyone to come through at least sometimes and get a sense of what's possible.
Yes.
A facility where the vocal booth is really controlled and the control rooms are really dialed and optimized, and that full body representation of music, that sort of low friction experience, everyone needs to find that. They need a sort of a sense of what's possible. So an example, of how we think about this is when we're doing our workshops, we ask clients to describe the best room they've ever heard, or maybe the best 3. What's the best? And quite often they'll come back with something that we know. It'll be a room in New York, or it'll be a room in LA or whatever.
Not going to name names?
Of rooms? No, we don't need to. But they'll describe an experience. So we have an internal scale of 1 to 10 of, and an example would be of, 1 being a very non-functional room and 10 being the best rooms we've ever heard. And, at 1 is kind of like office spaces with some,
the drop, what do you call it?
Yeah, the drop ceiling, almost no treatment. A typical kind of North Hollywood bedroom with some panels that they bought in the wrong place and
maybe some wall-to-wall carpeting.
Yeah, you're talking a 2 or a 3. Like, people are making records, but it's fucking hard, right?
Yeah.
And then, 8, 9, 10 is like the Northwood room that I get to work in. Rooms like this, the Anton room that we've designed, room that we did for Trent Reznor in the past, like our high watermarks of like what's possible. This full body, like immediately you sit down and everything feels right, and it's exciting, and it's emotionally engagement, and it translates to the car. That's a 10. Most people we meet, even people who've been making records a long time, haven't experienced that. They haven't experienced
the 7.
7, 8, 9, 10. So why that matters is because if I want to sell you my car, I'm going to bring you out front and I'm going to show it to you. And I'm saying, look, it's a 4-year-old car or whatever. It's got a dent here. I just put new tires on it. Now, take it for a spin. And we're going to drive around the block, and you'd be like, this is a car. But when we're doing a room, we're selling them something that's in the future. We're saying, we need to build you a custom car that fits you, but you can't test drive it.
Yes.
You have to trust us, right? And if we're saying, would you like a leather steering wheel or a regular steering wheel? They're like, what's a steering wheel? If they've never experienced it, then we're in trouble. We can't communicate, right?
Yeah.
So we try and get people, and we urge everyone, because it's not just young producers and mixers, we urge everyone to get experiences in great rooms. Hassle people that you know who have great rooms. If you're mastering a record with someone in a great room, go and try and attend if you can. Try and hear it. Try and get in here.
But also, just because it's a well-known studio that you recognize.
Yeah, exactly.
Doesn't mean
not
it's a
name
great
brand.
Exactly, yeah.
Because there are lots of A rooms in town and in
Yes.
New York and in London that suck. And we get the DMs all the time. Like we had a experience at the start of COVID from a producer friend of ours who's working in London on a giant record, and he's like, I don't know which way is up in this room. I'm in a A-list studio with an A-list performer and a deadline, and I can't tell. And in that case, the speakers were good, but the room was fucked.
Yeah.
So that process of everyone try and level up your sense of what's possible, because that helps you, make the kinds of decisions that you need to make, and also strive. Once you've heard that, you can start working towards it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I want to tag on this because it's so fundamental. I know we have a lot of questions
please,
and
this is super
questioners, but
interesting.
this is when I think about like audio engineering in general. Like, what is it for? What are we all doing? Right? It's in service of something greater than ourselves, right? It's in service of music, this magical thing that makes us feel connected, this thing. I say magical because we don't really understand how it does it, right?
Yeah.
But it creates a kind of relational awareness in us, a connection to other people across space and time. And it guides us through the way we process the world. It's just such an important, essential aspect of the human experience, right? So the reason why monitoring is so important is because when you can engineer the monitor path, the speaker in the room out of the way, you make direct contact with the power of music.
Yeah.
Right? And you can tell with greater clarity and immediacy what's working and what isn't, right? What records take over your body and which ones don't. Whether or not you're in the mood that day to be available, right? So the sooner one can experience this, like the power of music in a direct way, the sooner you get your sea legs, like the sooner you actually enter the field. If you're still translating and still theoretically interacting with music in an indirect way, you're not actually practicing the craft. Now, this is kind of an absolute way to put it, but you're dealing with almost music, a term that
Yeah.
John Castelli is working on right now. When you interact directly with music, it perpetuates a kind of respect and causes one to take more of a hands-off approach, a more passive way of thinking, and a more careful, to become more careful about the way you intervene. And to me, that's like a break point where I see a lot of music professionals wrestling records into existence or wrestling them across the line in a way that, how do I put it? It's like, it's as if it's their responsibility to make the record good. But that's not the role of audio engineering. Audio engineer is meant to, you connect the audience with the moment of inspiration, right? You're responsible for the technological pipeline between the event and the listener.
Yeah.
So in the same way, our relationships, if we seek power and control in our relationships, we cut ourselves off from our greatest source of power, which is connection. And it seems to me that audio engineering is very much the same way. If we're trying to control and get power over these records that we lose sight of what makes music great, and we start to interfere.
Yeah.
So that's why what Rory's saying about seeking out these opportunities to experience it, I think that is fundamental to being an audio engineer, whether or not you're a producer engineering your own things, artist engineering your own things. It's establishing that respect for the power of music and then figuring out how you fit in and not getting in the way.
And also
it's a different way of thinking.
One of the biggest and hardest lessons I learned in my engineering career is that being an audio engineer is not setting up microphones, and it's not getting levels, and it's not making a clean recording. Those things are an aspect of it, but those are not what makes a great recording engineer a great recording engineer. Mm-hmm. The great recording engineers sometimes are not even that good at that, but they can facilitate creation. They can understand what's important, or maybe they can intuit what is important to the producer and the artist, and create an environment and a workflow that lets them, the actual creators of the music, freely create.
Yeah.
You know, and if you can inject some sort of creativity as an engineer, cool. But ultimately, you've got to go like, I work regularly with a producer who's absolutely brilliant. And like many brilliant people, is incredibly scattered. You know, like if you just leave him on his own, he can get stuff done because he's amazing. But if you actually get him to focus and like to stop worrying about technical issues and to stop worrying about, you know, whether he's going to eat lunch or any of these things that might distract him, he can create amazing works of art, things beyond what I'm capable of doing. You know, I need someone like that in my life so that I get to just enjoy what I do. Mm-hmm. So for me, that lesson of facilitating creators is how I've approached this project that we've taken on. It's all about sort of refining what it is that they're really good at, and also, even though it's hard, identifying what they're not good at. And if you can engineer solutions so that they don't have to think about what they're not good at, and they can focus on what they are good at, now we've got a really effective workflow.
It goes back to say what Rory mentioned earlier too. If people aren't aware of what the possibilities are, it's kind of hard to gauge where you are on that scale, because the scale of like 1 to 10 doesn't only go for rooms or environments. I think it also goes for not someone's abilities, but recognizing someone's strengths or weaknesses. I feel it's very important to have a environment where you can actually make those calls on your own abilities and what do you need to strengthen, which aspects are you sufficient in already, like those.
But consider the creator. If they are a person who is sort of pragmatic about what it is that they do well and what it is they don't do well, you can have those conversations with them.
Yeah.
But maybe they're not a person who thinks that way. Maybe to focus their attention on what they're not good at is just going to cause them to go, well, I need to get better at that thing.
Yeah, no, I'm not saying it's about evaluating a level of skills that the client has. I'm saying this is kind of a part of unfucking someone, I guess, right? Is for them to maybe not even have to worry about it, but you guys identify what the issues are.
But we don't have to say necessarily. I mean, we have these conversations. We don't necessarily have to say to them, "You're bad at this."
No, exactly. Right? That's what I mean. Like that's.
But we can go, "Hey, this is the thing that they're really good at. How can we make sure that they're focused on that?"
Exactly. It doesn't have to be like, "Here's your report card. Right. Now let's treat you accordingly."
Yeah. You want to inspire people. You want them to come away from it feeling good about it. And maybe occasionally you have to identify some actual problem with something they're doing, but most of the time. Sorry?
Yeah, no, I think, just to sort of get ahead of it, because some people are probably thinking that a classic question we get is like, but, Spike mixes on KRKs in whatever kind of room, or Clear Mountain, on his NS10s or whatever. And it's our classic comeback is like, well, are you them? Like, are you those guys, these phenoms, these 1 in a million mixers or producers or whatever, And
if they say yes, then that doesn't matter.
Yes. Sometimes
the NS10 doesn't matter.
There are people who don't sort of want to go there. They don't want to do this, and that's okay too. If someone is not ready to sort of step up the quality of the playback or whatever, then they're not ready for it, and maybe they'll find it or maybe they won't. But I guess something that's very apparent is so much of record making these days is people, we teased this out on the podcast, and you mentioned that you were re-listening to episodes, so maybe you've come across it. But one of, when I got into making records, like I started 28 years ago for like my first paying clients, and this to me was a space of pioneers and innovators and dangerous thinking and risks and creatives and rule breakers. And now there seems to be an unbelievable amount of sort of like, what's everyone else doing? What's everyone else using?
Yeah.
It's sort of this group think. And of course, that's like, social media means everyone's gear and aesthetic choices are in your face.
There's more information available or misinformation than it ever has been.
Yeah.
I think that's why this is such a valuable conversation.
There's also a market for pro audio that there never was.
There never.
Yes.
But
Sure.
even think about, when I was making records at the start, just A-being something meant like getting a CD out of the CD player fast enough and getting the next one in. Like now
Yeah.
all of our records are released into Spotify, where artists are like, well, I'm going to be on a playlist between whoever and whoever. It's this constant mode of comparison. So, that's something that I think is a problem in this space right now, where everyone is sort of looking to their peers, and their peers are looking to, Pensado's place, and we have a problem.
Yeah.
So I think something that we're learning over the last couple of years is that the way that we think about things, this sort of holistic approach, I think of a company like GIK that you mentioned earlier. GIK, the people who run that company are friends of mine. They're really good people. They make good stuff. They're reliable. Everything about it is a great company. They're offering a product and you buy it or you don't.
Exactly.
Our process is much more. It's a deeper process, and there's more engagement, and sometimes it can be tricky because we ask tough questions, and
at every level, it's bespoke. Even on the small rooms, it's fully bespoke. It's about what do you need.
An example of a tough question that we ask a lot, and then we'll go on to the next question. A tough question we'll ask people a lot, and this has stumped. And usually I'll like warn people, like, this is coming, and these are the kinds of questions that Spider and I ask each other for fun, and Kyle and I. But say a young mixer, and we say to her, if I have the budget to hire Spike or Serban or Manny, and let's be honest, all of the clients you dream of do. They're all label clients or successful clients. So if I have the money to hire Spike or Serban or Manny, why would I hire you?
Great question. Yeah.
Right? What is your unique offering? What is your... Now, we ask that because we want to build a studio or inform gear choices, or like, say, for example, let's say the answer is, I go deep with a client, I take time, I'm a longer term partner. I'm not moving stuff through a pipeline for major labels. I'll go deep with an artist and produce a record over months. So say that's their answer, and they say, well, wait a second, or we'll say, well, wait a second, you said you wanted to load up your credit card to build this studio, right? You want to put 50 grand on 3 credit cards you just opened. That sounds like it's really going to impact your headroom to be present in the room with a client. Like, yes, we need new treatment. Yes, we need new speakers. But if you have a bunch of debt, how are you going to be present in the room with this artist? So if your unique selling point, if the thing that makes you different as a mixer or a producer or whatever to these A-listers is something, we want to do a whole process that supports that. And sometimes that means, bro, you got to double down and invest in yourself. You got to upgrade these speakers. You got to find the money, talk to mom and dad, whatever. Other times it's like, don't spend that money.
Yeah.
Keep the headroom. And don't quit Starbucks. Keep waiting tables. Like, if you want to make weird art records and you believe that you can do that and make a living, then you need to maintain your day job. The advice is very different, So yeah, I don't know where I started.
Yeah,
but
we're not an acoustics company.
I hope that's pretty apparent for anyone.
And I will say
right
we've learned a lot, and we're trying to figure out where that goes. And I think there will be more clarity on that for people in the future in terms of offering this sort of holistic thing in some way separate to the studio design process too,
Yeah, with some clients it becomes an ongoing relationship, where their clients are bouncing ideas off of us if they're planning a move. gear choices, all this sort of thing. It's not just the studio design, it's really the whole studio life.
And there's steps to it as well, right? It depends also how far you along in your career, the reality of how you might treat someone, someone's environment might change depending on more success or further down the line, kids on the way. Those kind of things all play a role,
all the factors.
Right?
Yeah, all the factors.
So that actually, there's a person asking a great question that kind of ties in with this.
Can I first jump back 5 subjects?
Of course.
Sorry. I
Start
do want to
over.
say, I feel, well, I'll ruminate on this forever if I don't say something. The reflection filter thing. I don't mean to, talk badly about a company that's earnestly trying to make a good thing. There's definitely a use for them. As a divider, as a gobo, you might be in a space where you're tracking with something and you need better isolation. They can help with that.
I think
Those
it's
little
totally fair
gooseneck
to-
ones that go between the snare and the hi-hat, useful.
Yeah.
But
I think it's fair to point out that a product is maybe advertised to be more sufficient than it actually is. That's
Sure.
totally fine. And I think
It's
the
a lot
reflection
of
filter...
over-promising out
Yeah,
there.
and also the physics don't make sense with it. You put it behind the microphone on the off axis when you
Right.
still get reflections on axis from behind you. So it just physically doesn't make sense, and it's fine to point that out.
But I don't want SE to stop making products.
No, keep making
You know?
products. Just
Like,
don't.
I don't
don't put all your
want people
hopes
to
in-
expect that to make
Yeah.
a regular room sound like a well-treated.
It's
Don't
not
use
gonna
it on their
sound.
vocals.
Yeah, it's
Don't
not
use
gonna
it on
sound
their
like a U47 in Capital Studio
Sorry,
A
SE.
if you put that in there. That's like also a reality. You can get maybe some better.
It's not a portable vocal booth, and
Exactly.
it will cause problems.
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, sorry, your question.
The question was, so now that we kind of got a sense of what you guys do, what your process is, how you are specifying on the holistic approach with treating someone's environment and that person. Someone asked here, the name is Sloth with 4 O's.
Slew.
What are some red flags when it gets to acousticians, studio designers, people who say they can help you leveling up your environment? What's something to look out for? I'll leave it up to you to answer that.
That's
to be very measured in our response.
Yeah, I
to
have
this
a lot of
question.
inflammatory thoughts.
Yeah. I was just thinking as Kyle was saying, as Kyle went back, and I think rightly to the reflection filter topic. A space I have no interest in occupying in the world is building credibility by shitting on other people.
For sure.
It's just not useful, and it doesn't feel good as a listener or as the person, Don't hire this guy, he's shit. Don't buy that thing, that sucks. And the reality is, I'm quite opinionated on a lot of things, and I do sort of fall into that mode sometimes. Like,
maybe let's rephrase this question in a positive spin.
Yeah.
What's something someone should look out for when they're hiring an acoustician or someone to treat their room?
That
That might be a little bit of a less
I love that framing.
inflammatory question.
I suppose, if we had a generalized mission, if this thing became a nonprofit in the morning, it is to start encouraging people to think a little bit more from first principles and to not look to their peers for influence. Just because your buddy spent 5K on Trinov, and just because he's raving about it in his room, you have to ask the question, it's like, well, is he qualified to give that advice? Should he be giving you advice? Can he perceive the difference? Does he have speakers that reveal the differences? So I think we're trying to encourage people across the board.
But we're asking people in that regard, just like when we say, what rooms have you heard, to be able to answer a question that they don't have any sense for what the answer should be.
Yes.
There isn't a point of reference.
And that's what I'm saying.
So,
is
but
I think
I-
we're
but-
encouraging people to start that journey. Not to be experts on
But
everything.
Spark the curiosity.
They should be
Yes.
on that journey no matter what if they're planning on being a creative.
But there's a lot of misleading information out there, right, that might not even encourage people to ask themselves those questions.
I would say that if you were looking for an acoustician to advise or to design, you should, number one, talk to them. If they sound like if they're evasive, if they sound like they're selling you a line, they probably are. And I'm not saying that everyone is that way, because they're not. There are definitely fantastically skilled acousticians who specialize in all manner of acoustics.
Yeah.
Some control room design, some build great live spaces, some focus on
restaurants
and churches, and but first talk to them, and if you can't get them on the phone, then they're not right for you. Number one.
That's great.
Right. If you are a big corporate client, like that high-rise thing, I'm sure the high-rise can get John Storick on the phone, right? And the North Hollywood, bedroom producer, John Storick's probably not going to answer, because that's not his thing. So connect with them, right? If they're a person who sees things the way you see them, you're going to have a much better chance of the result being something that's useful to you.
Chance is key, because as we know, studio builds are very risky. We've seen, I don't know how many hundreds of studio builds that do not, or what percentage of studio builds actually produce the kind of experience that was hoped for.
Even getting it across the line is, I mean,
Yeah.
I can speak on that on first hand.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's,
But what if
yeah.
what if the experience that you hope for is fantastic color changing LED lights and that's the thing, that the acoustics are secondary
Yeah.
to your lighting.
That's back to a client who's never experienced or doesn't value.
Again, out of touch with the power of music.
Yeah, or just the what a room can be, or to do.
But I'm saying if they came to us and said, all of my favorite rooms are, we got the zigzags and the
Yes.
LEDs and all this stuff, from the get-go, we would go, we don't know if this is the right client for us.
Yes, we're not.
Right?
We're not
We don't
set
know
up
if what we value and the things that we are pushing toward are what they're pushing toward.
Yes.
Yeah, we'd look
And-
for a way in and a common ground, and we'd try to find
And
it.
we
I like
likely
your-
would find it. But
I like what Kyle said about, two people that come to mind that really sort of embody this way of dealing with clients. So Thomas John, Northern Acoustics, who is I worked with for years and is a friend and inspiration and genius. Every question I ever ask Thomas over dinner or on a text message, or he will very quickly draw me something on a napkin or explain a principle. So much of what we do day to day came from him. He was very generous, no withholding with his information, wants these good ideas to be in the world. He has secrets, because he's he has stuff that he does that no one else does,
Sure.
But always willing to explain, never saying, "Don't question the wizard." I'm the superior acoustician here. Jochen, who designed your facility,
Yes.
exactly the same.
Great
German,
example.
pragmatic, weighing compromises in a very open, very even-handed way, saying, well, we could do that, and it would cost a little more money and be slower, but the outcome will be better in this way,
Exactly.
and in this way that you can understand and you can get a grip on. They're really good signs, as opposed to, and I won't name names, but there are people who make promises that are clearly not backed up experientially. This room has excellent low-end performance. It's like, well, it doesn't when I'm standing here or over here, or I guess, if it sounds too good to be true, often it is. Good performance, really good performance. There's no really sort
well,
of
if they're using
cheap way to get there,
Yeah.
if they're using terms that are vague
or pseudoscientific.
pseudoscientific,
Yeah.
obfuscating
Mhm.
the actual answer to the question or dancing around an answer.
The other thing I
That's
would
a red
say,
flag.
one of the things that we found we had in common, like I've known Kyle, I don't know, online like probably 12 years, but in person probably like 8 or something. Spider about 8 years. But one of the, as we sort of like overlaid our experience of record making, like Spider and I had a lot of experience of being in shitty rooms, trying to figure it out. Kyle had better skills acoustically earlier in his career than we did, so he was building rooms and getting sort of iterations of practice. But one of the things that we have all experienced is meeting an acoustician, sometimes typically a kind of a stuffy old white guy who will show you graphs and sort of speak from a very detached point of view about what rooms are, like the optimum time domain performance of said spaces. And I'm like, bro, have you ever heard music? Like, do you listen to music? And they're like, yes.
Do you even like music?
Steely Dan's second record is their fine. And it's like,
Yeah.
Someone like that, I've learned from lots of those people. Some of them have good ideas, some not so good ideas. But if you can't communicate if you don't have a shared language around, like an example being Thomas designed the rooms for Skrillex. And because Thomas is in LA at Nest Studios, 3 rooms, gorgeous rooms. And because Thomas, it was in Belgium and I was here, and there were some iterations on the voicing of the speakers. I'm getting feedback from Skrillex, from Sonny, about what he needs, which is shock horror, more low end, right? And I've had the experience of an acoustician arguing with the client about why they no, that's not the optimum amount of low end, because look at this graph.
Wow.
I was like, I'm going to argue with Skrillex about how much low end he wants to have in his studio to make records.
Yeah.
Like,
His taste is his thing.
Yeah, exactly. That's his whole thing. So
that goes back to the earlier point. That's their linear version of a room, right? If he says, I need more low end, so it feels like my linear version of the room.
yes,
I need more low end.
and again, that club, that performing, that DJ experience,
Exactly.
and the room delivered it flawlessly. We just made some tweaks, and it was all there in the original design. There was headroom for that, so it worked beautifully. But that, when you're looking to hire someone, I guess look for that common understanding about what the project is, And if your priority is LED lights and looking like your bros studios,
And Instagram
then maybe
it up. Yeah.
that's okay too. But if you care about some of the things we've talked about, then make sure that that common language is there.
That's great advice.
Yeah, the questioner asking about red flags in a way, and I think we've answered in a way that implies that the client in this case, the hypothetical client, is qualified to evaluate and to distinguish between different acousticians. And I think I just want to come back to the idea that, like, becoming more curious and sort of humbling ourselves that we know less maybe than we thought we did about monitoring and how it works and what music can do will put us in a better position. If we're curious about it, we look into it, we learn about it, we'll be in a better position to make these decisions.
Yeah.
And maybe in this case, this person, mind you, someone like this would not ask that question, but this person is a working professional engineer who has great ears and knows what a good room is. They could ask, what rooms have you designed, and go listen to them and basically decide for themselves whether what you provide as an acoustician is what they're looking for. Our experience with Richard, like, clearly he can hear and knows what he wants. He can definitely choose whether whatever acoustician he's considering is able to deliver what he needs.
Very much so, yeah.
But in the case of the people who have never heard a 5, let alone a 7, you can't go, well, go listen to the room. And they go, well, it looks nice, and I think it sounds good. Sounds better than my home studio, but...
Yeah, the framework isn't there to really integrate the experience.
Can I tell this story and generalize it enough that I don't betray names? I have a friend who has Grammys and has mixed at a very high level for a very long time. And they were renting a studio, a very, very high level studio at one point that I was recommending that they should rent. And they came in to listen and loved it, but were confused by the sort of reality of the vocal in the middle. The vocal image was something that they had never experienced. So I was like, this is good. You want this. This is real.
Sorry, do you want to take a second and talk about what precise imaging actually is for someone who has not experienced that?
Yeah, we should come back to it in a second. So this guy was, despite years of making records, and I'm saying, no, this is absolutely what you want. This is good. This is a good attribute. I strive for this in rooms that I voice or in rooms that we're designing or whatever. And he was like confused by it. Brought in an acoustician friend of his who came in the room, listened, was like, this is fucking amazing. Like, what are you doing? Rent this room now. Like, But even this person who had been in the business 25 or 30 years, who'd mix at a very high level on records you've all heard of, had never really experienced that. They were used to the vocal being sort of diffuse and skewed and vague, and this sort of pinpoint, like Joni Mitchell is like she's standing between your speakers.
The holographic lifelikeness.
Yeah, that was new and almost alienating to him.
Yes.
Yeah.
So I guess I'm not disagreeing with you, and I'm just saying it brings us back to that thing of find rooms that are great, that have been proven to be great by people making records in them that translate, and get your ears on.
Hang on though,
What?
because we know that lots of great records have been made in subpar spaces.
That's not an argument against what we're
Yeah.
talking about. Though.
That would be-
But I'm saying, like, just
Yeah,
because
how do
you
you
know
choose one?
that some great sounding record was done in this space doesn't mean that space is great.
Well, that's hard, and that's where if you ask us directly, we can list specific rooms and we can rule out other rooms. But that's not something.
But I would say that the best way to approach kind of setting your standard is not to go to a room that somebody says is good,
Yes.
but is to go to a room that somebody says is good and listen carefully, make mental notes about what you hear, and then go to another room that someone
Or
says
feel.
is good.
Yes.
Even beyond hearing.
Sure.
Yeah.
But then to have something else that someone else says is good and go, regardless of what they say, do I hear, do I feel, does this
And without
connect
sounding like a
better?
shill, like about once a month at this point in DMs, I'm saying to people, just stop DMing me. Go do a day at Just for the Record. Like
That's awesome.
it's just plug-in money.
Yeah.
You're going to spend it on some bullshit thing to fix some bullshit problem that you shouldn't have in the first place if you recorded properly.
Yeah.
Spend a day and go and mix with one of your clients and hear what's possible.
Yep.
Well, there's an argument to be made that there's a certain level of subjectivity if you haven't ever heard what's possible, right? So I'm sure there's a bunch of responses you guys get where it's like, well, I'm used to this room. I know what I'm working up against. I'm compensating for it.
Yeah.
I know my headphones really well. Why should I
Yes.
get my room treated? I'm curious to hear what your response would be towards
Yeah.
a statement like
the
that.
The fundamental principle underlying all of this is that the brain and nervous system is an adaptation mechanism. So, like Rory was talking about this high-level mixer who'd never heard a lifelike razor-sharp vocal. They've been calibrated over years, so their expectations, the brain being an expectation machine, is expecting something different than what's coming. But given a little bit of time, that system can be recalibrated. And some of the resistance that we noticed in some clients and community around this is because they're maybe not thinking of themselves as adaptable and
Interesting.
capable of being, their calibration being adjusted.
Or might it also be that they might not even notice the tension that they have while they work in a subpar room and
Yes.
Well, yeah, the coping, we normalize, that's another thing, the aspect of adaptation in the nervous system
Yeah.
is normalizing,
So-
the fact that we're coping
Yeah.
and we're not actually thriving.
Like
what
your
are the
brain is-
criteria then? Because if we're talking about like getting somebody to raise their standard,
It's a cultural problem.
yeah, but what
Yeah.
are like you, Spider, or you,
Yes.
Rory, or me, or
Yes.
Moritz? What is your criteria for a great speaker system? I can tell you that I sit down and that's just me and personally how I interact with it.
Yeah.
Mid range is always the first thing that I focus on.
Huh.
I focus on that sort of relationship between vocal, snare, kind of where things sit there.
Yeah.
And then I start thinking about imaging. I start thinking about sort of precise details. And then I start thinking
It's
about...
a very stark difference between us.
Well,
Same,
obviously, we
yeah.
all approach things
Yeah,
differently.
yeah.
And then I start thinking about sort of low-end extension. How low does this go? How
Yes.
tight is this?
Yes.
Do I feel it? And
Do you have any physical response that you pay attention to when you approach a room for the first time? Is there like, I mean, that's just from my experience. I can feel my shoulders drop if it works. Sort of. It's like a weird thing. Like the ears are relaxed. It's like I don't know.
it's an overall relaxation.
It's like
for,
a
for
different.
me.
Yeah.
I think, Kyle, I go there if things are wrong. My criteria is
But we're talking about somebody who doesn't have a standard, or their standard is low.
Yeah, yeah.
We're saying, what should you go listen to when you go listen to
I
these
would
rooms?
say the bottom line criteria is how easily can you surrender to the record? How emotionally available is that relationship? And am I stimulated? Like, am I inspired with creative ideas?
That's because for me,
You know what I mean?
those things are completely disparate. My enjoyment of a record, or my emotional response to a record, is purely about the performance and the song and the melody. And
The sum
I can,
total.
but I'm saying I can get
yeah.
that visceral response whether I'm listening on an Auratone or whether I'm listening on some, MP3s.
I can't. I can have different kinds of response, but the power and the weight and the completeness with which my body becomes the music is different.
Maybe we can differentiate between. I mean, you could probably still determine if it's a good record, if it's
Sure.
crafted well, if it's written well, if the performance is compelling. You can probably still determine that on. Sorry, thank you. On something like this, right?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I
But
feel
then there's
the hips move like a shitty speaker in a restaurant. Like,
Sure, but there's like definitely a different.
it's a completeness. It's just a different experience.
But it's. I think what you're talking about is almost the sensation of the speakers disappearing.
And
where-
me disappearing.
Right.
If I'm thinking about the snare, I'm not in the space.
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. Well, what you are saying, I think you both are saying kind of the same thing. You just come
Well,
at it
that's
from a
pro-
different
that's
angle.
a problem. If I go into problem-solving mode, then I engage all the analysis and the.
I mean, ultimately, we're going to end up in the same spot.
Yeah.
The journey that we used to get there. But when I'm talking about analyzing a room or a speaker system, it is problem-solving mode.
Yes.
I'm not in there to listen to a song that I love.
Sure.
I'm in there to go, can I get an accurate depiction of this recording?
Yes.
But that's because
See,
you
he's
know.
the engineer, and I'd be the producer and artist.
And this
in
is
But
that
it's also
scenario.
Kyle knows what a song that you really like should sound like in an ideal scenario. So you have a comparison. Same with Ruairi or Spider.
Yeah.
You guys have a certain list of records that we also have here, where these are your reference points. You know how that can feel when it's feeling right,
Yes.
or like when it's at its
That's
fullest
the
potential.
Unfuck playlist. Anybody who wants a link,
Is that
Yeah.
please DM
should-
us in the Unfuck Project's Instagram.
It's a great playlist. There's
Yeah,
a lot of variety in
It's
it.
the greatest hits.
I think this really points to why there are three of us in this company, because we have a lot of shared experience and ideas, but we are different. We often talk about Kyle being the real pragmatist in the room, because Kyle makes records every day, and it doesn't really matter if your cornflakes went soggy in the morning, you're making a record. It's not
Yeah.
too warm and
Idealistic.
fuzzy and idealistic.
Yeah.
He's got records to make, mixes to deliver, and it's very pragmatic, and it's grounded in the real day to day of making records.
Yeah.
And Spider, you're much more idealistic and
Yes,
sort of
philosophical
perfectionist, and
yeah.
sometimes to a fault it can
Yeah.
be inhibiting.
Yes.
And
It's okay in pragmatism.
Kyle and I connect on technical stuff, and Spider and I connect on some of these more perfectionist tendencies and whatever. But when I'm in a room, like the guys are describing what sounds like two poles, and when I'm in a room, I'm channeling both of them. When I'm like voicing the speakers here, I'm feeling the way Spider feels, and then at some point I'm getting over myself the way Kyle does. It's like, enough already with the fucking around with the high end. Like, it's done. It's good. Like, can we ship this record? Like, the label is waiting.
Yeah.
Like, get over yourself, right? And we have within, like, something that we often joke about is it's very common for us in workshops with clients or in meetings with clients to argue with each other
Yes.
and to tease out a point in front of a client and to reach consensus, often from quite different places. Like, I think the client should spend the extra money, spend the extra 10,000 and do this. And Kyle's like, no, that's stupid. That's dumb. They could save that money. They could have a vacation. And I'm like, but it's worth it because of this. And we'll tease it out, and the client is looking at us. But ultimately, that's what we do, is sort of like spend the money like it's ours and build a room that we'd be proud to work in, or actually that we could actually really want to
And
work
make
in.
the absolute most out of the opportunity.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I can attest to that, working with you guys on. I mean, Ruairi was a part of trying to figure out the setup here from the very beginning, It's very much that. It's like you treat it like you spend your own money.
Yeah.
There's no bullshit recommendations.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's great. Do you guys want to hit some more questions?
Yeah.
Yeah.
How are we
Yeah,
on
yeah.
time? Have we?
I think we let's do 10 more minutes. Should we do like a lightning round?
Yeah, that sounds great.
Whatever you
Are you
need.
guys
Yeah.
cool with that?
Yeah.
And why don't we just each of us take one of the questions and just answer it
So
concisely?
do we have the hard out at 1:30? Is that
It's not a hard out. I think we gotta come back.
you've got important things to do?
No, also we gotta maybe do this again.
Yeah, I'd love it.
Yeah, I'd love
There's a lot of questions that we answered a couple, but there's a lot of interesting questions. So lightning round, bass trap versus regular membrane. No, I'm just
Oh,
kidding.
this is one for Kyle. I think you
That
should
is a
explain.
question actually, but you
Yeah.
don't have to lightning round it. But
No,
No,
it's all
it's
good.
lightning roundable actually.
Yeah,
this
what
one.
people call bass traps aren't bass traps often. Kyle.
You should take this one, Kyle.
What was the question?
So
Sorry.
the question in detail is: when do you choose membrane bass traps versus regular fiberglass bass traps? And for regular, I mean deep corner angle traps, and also in the context that each is built well.
Gotcha. Okay, so this is really a question of we never did talk about our time domain stuff, which maybe we should spend our lightning round talking about, because if
Yeah,
there's one thing that we need to get
crucial.
across, it's time domain. But the answer to that is that there's basically sort of two types of absorbers, right? You have what we call velocity, porous things, fiberglass or rock wool or cotton, or basically things that respond to movement of air and turn that into heat. And they are very effective as long as there is air movement. They are the product of choice for room treatment everywhere that there is air movement. But the problem is that as you get to the boundary, there isn't, right? It behaves as pressure. Maybe the best example of that is, granted, it's a different wave behavior, but if you're talking about a guitar string, anybody who plays guitar palm mutes. Where you palm mute on a low string is different from where you mute on a high string. Because basically, as that wave gets close to the bridge, you get no movement in the string. This is actually why bridges are compensated, right? Because the stiffness of the string means that you don't get any movement at that boundary of density. So that area where it doesn't move basically changes with the frequency. So if you tune your guitar string down lower, you could move your palm in further without it damping that primary note. But a higher tuned string, you have to move closer to the bridge in order to dampen it, because that pressure zone, if we're talking acoustically, is closer to the boundary. And the transition between movement, velocity, and pressure basically is a quarter of the length of the wavelength. So this is why we would say that a velocity-based absorber is limited in terms of its low-end performance by how far away it is from the boundary. And this is assuming that the boundary is a perfect boundary, and none of them, at least in homes, are.
So it makes a difference if it's a concrete wall
Yeah,
or
let's
dry
talk
wall.
about
Exactly.
theoretical boundaries for the sake of this.
I mean, because we, to our advantage, and one of the things that we do a lot is this sort of iterative approach to acoustics. You can get a really, really great sounding space without designing from the ground up if you're willing to take the time to stick a microphone in a place and run a sweep and see how it's behaving and treat the problem as it correlates to the mix position or the listening position. And it might not be as cool and integrated as a custom bespoke, Z level room, but the results can still be as or nearly as good. It just requires you to take the time. And so if we're in a home studio where the walls are, just
Almost
drywall,
puros, or like it goes through.
right, that can really help our low end performance, because essentially at the lowest octave, there's no wall in terms of the sound.
Just
it just
goes
passes
straight
through it.
through.
Not good for your neighbors,
Yep.
but
as something actionable for people, membranes, even the off-the-shelf commercially available ones, need skill to deploy. to know what frequencies, where to put them, what the limits are. How
Sorry, when we start talking about membranes, we're talking about that pressure-based absorption.
Yes, which is the question was
Right.
mineral wool like super chunks in the corner
Versus-
or membranes.
But it's not doesn't have to necessarily be membranes. It could be VPR. It
Yes,
could be
yeah,
membrane.
other pressure based.
Yeah.
The super chunks for the money offer value. The corner traps that he described or she described, but they're quite limited in what they can do, and I've messed with them quite a bit, back in the day. So
There is some theory that if you use a denser absorption material, like a 703 or 705, that it starts to behave as a membrane in the corner. And there might be something to that, but in general, when we're talking about the bottom sort of 2 octaves, or really anything 100 hertz or below, we really need to be focusing on targeted, tuned, pressure-based.
Now, are we talking about just like a 2x4 typical panel sort of mounted across a corner? Or are we talking about triangular pieces
in that case,
stacked?
It would be
that's what he was describing. Or she was
either
describing.
stacked or you do a panel where there isn't a gap outside of it. It's corner
just a triangular
side to side,
panel.
and you might do a lighter density behind it.
Yeah.
But
I mean, how many? One of the things I noticed, like in the Thomas rooms, is like there's many feet of soft stuff in the back to deal with low end. Is that
It's many feet of base treatment. It isn't
just soft things.
That's one of his secrets is what's in there.
Yeah, the exact composition.
But the question is then like how much real estate do we need to actually use a mineral wool-like product to get down low? Or a fiberglass product to get down low enough?
The depth of a rear wall is really all about that crossover point between your porous material, your velocity absorption, and your pressure. And so if we have a pressure-based absorber, like a limp membrane absorber that's, say, tuned to 50 hertz, because our room is 12 feet long or 21 feet long or 11.3. So if we have that at 50 hertz and we have designed it so that it works basically across a whole octave. So it's
sorry to interrupt you for a second. You just gave a specific room number. Was that in correlation to the waveform?
No, it's just because I said 50 hertz. So
and 50 hertz would be
if you had a
cycle of how long? Let's just say, for example, just so people understand what your thought process is when you describe
Sorry,
it.
so I'm talking about the response or the modal behavior from the front to back axis. We're hedging up against the time domain thing again. But as long as sound is bouncing between 2 surfaces or 4 surfaces or all 6 surfaces of a cuboid space, you're going to have interaction with itself, which is this modal behavior we talk about.
So if the distance of 2 surfaces
determines a note, basically, that
right,
rings.
if that's a multiple of whatever the length of a full cycle is of that frequency, then you get standing modes. That's correct, right? So you get a build-up at 50 hertz at that distance.
Yeah, so you'll have a build-up at if it's 11.3 feet, you will have a 50 hertz build-up right at this boundary. You will have a null in the center of the room, and you'll have 50 hertz at the far end.
And then at 101 or 2 hertz, you'll have a peak in the middle of the room and a dip at a quarter.
Because that's a multiple of 50.
And then
these things are...
So I think that was important for people to understand that there's like a sort of equation that you guys can apply in order to figure out what... If you know you have 2 hard surfaces with a distance, what's the frequencies that have problems?
Yes.
Yeah, so the problem there... we'll jump back to the rear wall question in a second, but the problem is that it's easy to calculate these predicted modal problems in a rectangle or a cuboid space, and assuming that the walls are poured concrete, right? Essentially a perfect boundary where they're going to reflect 100% of the sound back. But we're not building those spaces, and there are rooms like the mastering we were talking about where we can control all of those parameters and build something more along the lines of what Thomas would build, where you've engineered out the problems. But this is where this iterative treatment process was born from, because we would get in rooms where you look at the dimensions and you go, well, it should be doing this, this, and this. but it isn't.
Yeah. The
Why?
floor is doing a thing.
Right.
The walls are resonating a certain frequency, passing through at others.
Yeah. So in that
Yeah.
case, we that's why we started doing the thing that we now do regularly in these spaces, which is put a microphone at listening position and put a microphone everywhere that we could put targeted treatment and see what the correlation is between the problems you're having here and the problems you're having there. And in some cases, there's problems over here that make no difference in listening position.
Yeah.
But most of the time, you're seeing huge resonances in corners that equate to resonances and peaks or dips at listening position. And if we can kill them there, they fix the
We
problem
trap
here.
them there, keep them
Yeah.
from bouncing back and interfering.
Right.
So you were on to the crossover point in the
Right.
treatment
I'm sorry.
between
Sorry
So
for
if we have
interrupting.
a-
I just wanted to.
pressure and
Yeah, so if we have a
and
targeted
velocity.
a membrane absorber, and we've designed that so that it operates basically over an octave, give or take, and we need to basically make the whole rear wall anechoic, which is probably another thing we need to talk about in our lightning round. That's over last.
Yeah, we're
minute ago.
actively booking session 2
Yeah,
here.
sorry.
Assuming anyone watches.
So basically, just like you're crossing over between a sub and a woofer and a mid-range and high tweeter, you have to consider where the low cutoff is of that velocity absorption. So a lot of times you'll end up with a membrane at the boundary and a huge gap of nothing, just air, before you get to the false wall in front of it. Because once you exceed a certain amount of absorption, depending on how resistive to airflow it is, you don't gain anything by making it thicker.
So like more than 6 or 8 inches of rock wool isn't giving you much benefit.
Right. Yeah. At about 6 to 8 inches of rock wool, it starts sort of behaving like a boundary in its own way, because it's resistive to flow. But 6 or 8 inches of eco-touch fluffy stuff
It's not gonna do shit. Yeah.
Well, it's really effective, but it doesn't ever behave like a wall. Not until
That's
you
what, like,
get-
in terms of the base stuff, it might not do what you're looking for with
It's-
that, right?
There's surprisingly almost no instance where fluffy stuff is outperformed by rigid stuff.
Yeah.
But there are a few instances, but mostly we would specify a more rigid material like a 703 because of some construction consideration,
Right.
where we need
Yeah,
to
like
make sure
fluffy
it's not
doesn't stay fluffy.
right. Like you have to.
There is gravity and
Well, we can also say that with a disclaimer, that statement that you just made, that base treatment most of the time is more effective when it's rigid, comes with the caveat of you guys doing the due diligence with measuring these things.
Sure.
So maybe that's not applicable for someone who's asking what base strip should I buy.
Right.
Might not be applicable to just say it's
But
a
that
membrane.
depth,
base
though,
strip.
that depth question is just all about finding that crossover between the velocity-based stuff and the pressure-based stuff.
Yeah.
And we've definitely had learning experiences where, we built a tuned cloud where the velocity portion was just too close to the membrane portion, and there is a ringing at what was it, like 400 hertz, whatever that grams thing.
lower to something, but
Yeah. And it was just like, well, we thought we could make this thing work, and you know what? We didn't.
that's
So
part
we
of the
need to fix it.
iteration.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So-
We're also the iteration is to spend as little money as possible.
yeah.
It's like a haircut, which is
Right.
kind of the theme of the day.
Mm-hmm.
Like we'll do a first pass on a room for a client like Graham's, and if there are any niggling issues, then you just tack them on, and that really helps us again keep these budgets under control.
Yeah.
you
I've
know.
been surprisingly silent for like 10 minutes listening,
Sorry.
trying to listen and channel what it would be like as someone in a bedroom in North Hollywood or a producer
You've already
studio listening
logged
to this.
off.
I know it's so
And
complex.
it's intense, and I think you're trying to give people actionable things, and people want answers like I'm thinking of a record making analogy, like what's the best compressor for vocals?
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, well, is this Cardi B or Diana Krall?
Yep.
Like, what are we talking about
Yeah.
here? Every question leads to more questions, and there is no what's the best bass treatment, what's the best
Yep.
speaker. Like, everything is contextual, and
Yes.
that's why we've landed on this holistic approach. And really, whether it's us or not, and there's a very defined limit to how much work we can handle, whether it's us or not, you want someone to help you. You know, if you ask a great mixer, like a Tony Maserati or a John or whatever, like what is the best thing for snare, or what is the best whatever? Why did you do that? Quite often it's like many layers down from even like conscious thought. They're operating intuitively, having done many reps. Like I was thinking earlier, this thing of pleasing clients like Skrillex or whatever, I displeased many clients for many years. Like I've made all the mistakes with all the clients. I've done the wrong thing for Al Schmidt, and I've done the wrong thing for lots of famous people. And I've been given notes, you know, done many good things, but like I've missed the mark many times to sort of, there's been many iterations. Like you do a lot of bad mixes before you start doing good mixes, or bad masters, or write bad songs. So I think as a piece of actionable advice, you say, well, we just got very into the tricky stuff about no, it's necessarily complex. Find yourself a partner who can help you navigate that. It's not wise for most clients to learn this stuff themselves.
Yep.
It's not a good use of your time. If you want to make records, make records. If you want to be an acoustician, by all means, knock yourself out and go for it. The world needs them, right? But find yourself a partner who can wield those kinds of tricky trade-offs in service of your project.
Great.
You know, that's.
I honestly think that's an amazing point to close out on. That's great advice, and it's also I can second that. I don't.
I do have a request.
Yes.
Before we close out,
Of course.
can we summarize, because we keep saying we're going to talk about it and we don't, the time domain versus frequency response, this thing that we keep saying is so important, but we haven't actually talked about.
So much of a cliffhanger.
Full credit to Thomas again, who taught me so much of what I know about this, and Kyle had his whole journey in terms of learning about it, and we sort of melded those concepts together. Time domain response speaks to when you people talk about flat rooms or flat speakers, and they imagine a straight line and that all the frequencies are evenly represented, and that's good. In reality, as we said on our last video, we don't want a flat response in a typical room. We want a rising response at the low end. How much depends on the client and depends on the time domain response. So what is time domain response? That is, frequency response shows, you know, how much 100 hertz there is relating to 10K, relating to 1K. It's that graph, right? We've all seen it. Time domain response is what happens to those frequency bands over time. So when you put, a good example that I often use is like a tight electro kick drum, or an 808. When you put that energy into the room, how long does it hang around? Reverb is the wrong way to look at it, but how long does that energy stay ringing in the room?
Are you talking about after the actual signal
leaves the speaker?
Yes.
Leaves the
yeah,
speakers.
after it's so you're looking for extended decay in the room. Is there any, and if so, how long?
Yes, and what is it at different frequencies?
Okay.
Now, it's very normal, even in good old school rooms, for that time domain response, for that how long the energy hangs around, to increase at low frequencies. And what you want to really avoid, like the old BBC specs on their studios years ago, was it's okay for it to get longer as you go down in frequency. Our ears are fairly forgiving, but what you want to avoid is big peaks and differences between adjacent bands. So a good example is, we're doing a run of 808s, you know, boom, 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 boom. And this one seems to go on for, you know, a week. It's very hard. Immediately, someone will reach for an EQ or a compressor or a dynamic upward multi-band expander, some bullshit, to try and solve that.
Yes,
and you're saying,
been there.
bro, slow down, put on your headphones. Is that in the record or is that in the room? Oh, shit. Yeah, it's
And I think it's important to note that this time domain thing, because it's happening after the speakers, is not something that can in any way be corrected before the speakers.
Right.
So even though that resonance interacting with, you know, new sound coming out of the speakers is what's causing your peak or your dip, you might be able to EQ that in such a way that it looks as though you're not having a wildly different frequency response. That, you know, it looks, even if it has a rising low end, it looks reasonably flat. It must be good. But the fact is that note is still ringing, and your brain can not hear around this thing, which is, it's physically happening in the room.
Yeah.
It's literally there.
Yeah, which is why we don't think of EQ as correcting or room correction.
You
It's more of a
can't
taste
fix
thing,
rooms with
maybe a
EQ.
preference
Yeah.
thing, but
Yeah.
not a.
A good
Yeah.
record to kind of check that phenomenon is what you also have on the playlist, Partition by Beyonce, I think. I heard you guys using that a lot.
We use that weirdly more for frequency response
Yep.
because it lacks transients, but there are...
Yeah.
And you'll hear them pop
what
out.
are the two...
Well, you do Black Skinhead, but
Black Skin is a different test for me. What are the two Rodriguez Jr. tracks?
Yeah, the low.
They have this busy,
lo-fi Pelican.
moving bass line, and it
Yeah.
really
Dum,
betrays
dum, dum,
the room
dum,
if there's
dum.
ringing at lower frequencies,
Yeah.
Shoot
Yeah.
us a DM for the playlist if you're interested. We'll
Yeah.
send it out.
Yeah, definitely do at Unfuck Projects on Instagram. But
Yeah.
yeah, the time domain thing we think of as more important than frequency response. And also, frequency response graphs need to be taken with a grain of salt. They're often presented in too high a resolution, in a way that looks really scary, that doesn't reflect the way your neurological system works, the way hearing works.
That Jamanson curve plays a role in that too, right? How the frequency response of the ear is also not flat. So
Yeah, it's an
it's a lot
adaptive
about-
multi-band
it's
mechanism.
your brain is able to hear around those things. It fills in
Yeah.
these holes, and it does that very, very well, and you don't even notice it.
Yeah.
So there are definitely times where you might have we had that question about the 80 hertz or whatever, a floor bounce thing where you're noticing you're always missing that.
Yeah.
That's a different problem. But in terms of the general kind of up and down,
Scary lines.
yeah, it's not that bad. But if you have notes in the room that are just ringing, there's nothing you can do
it's very problematic.
beyond physically fixing those, and they
Yeah.
drastically impact what you're listening to.
yeah,
Which is really what all of this stuff is about. It's about making sure that we are making intelligent, informed decisions about our recording without having the room lie to us.
yeah.
And this is like, when I hear us talking about stuff like this, it feels to me like we're talking to a luthier all of a sudden about the composition of the bridge and the various trade-offs and the things like, bro, I just want to fucking jam with my friends. Like, I just want to play my Les Paul and like Jimmy Page, right?
That's what we want too.
And really, and that's, I think, our role is to wield these tools, these understandings, these lessons we've learned, the things that that we've been given by very generous people, and in service of the thing we really care about,
Yes.
which is records and what they can do, and how they can sort of make an impact in the world. Not so much status, the power of music to like connect people and to as a shared experience and as something that can be, that can help
That's
make people feel
beautiful.
less alone, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I love that. On that note, thank you guys so much for coming.
Thank you, Morris.
Thank you.
Thanks for everyone who submitted questions.
Sorry we didn't get to
Well,
them.
if we can do a round two at some point, we'll save
yeah,
those
I think that would be
questions.
fun. I think we should do that
Or-
at some
Yeah.
point. Yeah.
Keep
Or
them
if
at the
there's
head of the
I guess
line.
if a question didn't get answered, hit us up in DM and we'll try and if it's something that you're struggling with or whatever,
Yeah.
like we'll try and help.
Awesome. Thank you guys so much.
Yeah, man.
All right,
Thanks,
thanks,
Matt, in
everyone
the
for
booth.
watching.
Yeah, thanks to the team for
everybody
setting us
here.
up this
Thank
morning.
you. Yeah. Shout out to Matt for
Yes.
engineering
Yeah,
and
every-
producing
Woo,
Matt
Matt.
Cerritos and Denise Cruz for producing as well.
Ooh, Denise.
Yeah.
We'll be back soon.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks,
All
Morris.
right.